get the hang of the slides. So thank you, Marianne, for the introduction. This short talk tonight kind of came out of an article that I was asked to write for the FIP Flash magazine. For those of you who are familiar with what FIP is, it's the International Federation which is responsible for or coordinates international exhibitions and also coordinates the various commissions that deal with the sectors of philately, the Traditional Commission, the Postal History Commission, the Thematic Commission, the Postal Stationery Commission, and also for Maxima Philly and for Revenues and Aero Philately. The FIP has been around for many, many years, and it's been I say latterly, a fairly controversial organization. It has its fans and it has its critics, and you know, I don't know how familiar any of you are with it, but it's very much part and parcel of philately at the international level. Each national organization supports the FIP with subscriptions, and also has, when the FIP has its congresses, each of the delegates has a vote, and it works on a fairly democratic basis. Over and above the member organizations, there is the board of the FIP, which administers it and which appoints coordinators to different exhibitions, and which generally authorizes or gives credentials to the various international exhibitions that take place. So that's just a little background as to kind of where this talk originated. I had shared a copy of it with Marianne, and she suggested that this might be of interest to some of the members in Wisconsin. So if you like it, I take all the credit. If you don't, I'm happy to share the blame with Marianne. So moving forward, essentially, one of the questions which seems to be coming more and more to the fore is, what is really philately all about today, and what was it in the past? Now, of course, in the internet age, we automatically go to things like Wikipedia and we educate ourselves on that basis. And here is essentially what Wikipedia says philately is: the study of postage stamps and postal history. A second facet to it that's important is the actual collection, appreciation, and research activities on stamps and other philatelic products. Now, it's more than just, as Wikipedia says, it's more than just owning stamps and philatelic material. There is more to it. You could study material in museums, you could study articles, you could study books. So whilst most of us think of it as the immediate collection of philatelic material and the ownership of philatelic material, it is somewhat more than that in a traditional sense. Now, if we look at different individuals, we can see how philately means different things to different people. As I said, most of us think of stamp hinges, stamp albums, catalogs, and tongs. There are others of us whose life centers around research, writing, publishing of articles, and books. For others, the creation of exhibits for competition is really what stimulates them and gives them their philatelic enjoyment. For others, they want to be involved in organized philately. They want to be an officer of a society, a group, a national or international organization. There are others who are judges who want to sit in judgment and express their opinions on others' collections. And then, of course, there's in my mind, the most important group, and that is the stamp dealers and the auctioneers. Now, it's always important to put your, how do I put it? Put your vested interest or your, you know, your bias to the fore. And quite frankly, one of my important biases is to promote the interests of the stamp dealers and the auctioneers. And I have no hesitation in saying that, to me, that is a very, very important constituent of the hobby, and unfortunately one which is often ignored. Sadly, the dealer organizations don't always work in harmony with the collector organizations, and I think very often the the voices of the dealers are not heard as loudly and as clearly as they should be. So my bias explained, my bias given. Let's move on. Now, philately has always been a very conservative and really largely unchanging hobby. If you look at essentially the practice of philately up until very, very recently, largely this year, it's really been very little changed in 100 years. The structures, the practices of organized philately have changed very little. And many of the issues which we keep hearing about today are not new issues at all. For example, if you look in the late 19th century, in articles in general philatelic publications, they constantly talk about the lack of young collectors. They criticize the abundance of new issues, and they say, where is the hobby going? Where is the future of the hobby going to be? What's going to happen 10, 20, 30 years ahead? Who's going to be there to buy the stamps that I'm going to be selling? Where are the new generation of collectors going to come from? Now, I'm sure all these issues resonate with all of you. You hear about it, you read about it. It's something that's very much in people's minds. It's not a new problem. It's a problem that's been there for well over a century. Now, what are some of the sort of contemporary issues, some of the contemporary problems that really philately has had, say if we take the last 20 to 25 to 30 years? Well, I think we all recognize that there is a declining number of collectors. There's an aging of the population of collectors. There's a drop in most society memberships, especially the local general societies. I remember, well, 45 years ago, for example, in Cambridge in the UK, the Cambridge Philatelic Society, which was the second philatelic society that was really involved with, they used to have a membership of about 300. They used to have about 150 attend every single meeting. The last presentation which I gave to the Cambridge Philatelic Society, which was a couple of years ago, they had about a dozen members at the meeting. So about 10% of what they used to have 45 years ago. And I'm sure if you look at most local societies here in the US, certainly in the UK, and also in countries in Europe, it's the same problem, a declining membership. We also have significantly less attendees at shows and exhibitions. In the old days, you would have queues of people waiting to get into exhibitions. If you looked at the ASDA shows in New York at Madison Square Gardens back in the 70s and 80s, those shows were crowded. The last few ASDA shows in New York, you'd be lucky to see more than maybe 30 to 50 people in the show at any one time. One of the important aspects, which is a problem for philately today, is the rising costs of organizing shows, administering societies, and for publications. The cost of everything goes up constantly. The street level stamp stores that have disappeared, not just here in the US, but also around the world. Household names, the long established household names of philately, many of them have disappeared. Many of them have diminished in stature from where they used to be. And lastly, and important to all of us, many stamp values for stamps and covers have declined. In many cases, they've declined significantly. There are exceptions, but if you look at the picture across the whole, the value of many stamps and covers has declined significantly, not just in relative terms, but in absolute terms too. Now, take another metric. Membership of the American Philatelic Society. Now, here are figures for December 31st in the years 1990, 2000, 2010, and 2019. And the drop is significant, 57,000 down to 28,000, almost 29,000. That's a significant drop over the period from 1990 to 2019. Now, that decline is replicated in many, many other national organizations around the world. The possible exception would be India and China, where numbers do continue to increase. And quite frankly, the numbers are also significantly higher than those of the American Philatelic Society. Now, everybody is quick to point the finger at what is the cause of what's happening in philately? Many people say it's coincidental to the decline in letter writing and the use of the mail service. Well, that may be one cause, possibly, but it's certainly not the only cause. Other factors which people are quick to emphasize, they talk about how we've lost a generation of children. Children have competing interests and other activities that distract them. This doesn't just affect the children, it also affects the older generations as well. There's clearly also a lack of coordination between organized philately and post offices globally. I mean, if we take an example, the ASDA used to have a very, very good working relationship with the USPS, the US Postal Service. The APS summer shows, the ASDA shows in New York, there was a very, very good working relationship. I don't know what's happened to that relationship latterly, but there does appear to be a lack of the harmony that used to exist. Others will say, well, people don't see stamps in their everyday life. If you go into post offices to mail a package, what are they going to do? They're going to print a label. They're not going to give you stamps. Many of the philatelic services counters in post offices around the world have closed or they've been reduced. Others argue that there are just too many new issues. The modern issues also, in many cases, now sell for significantly below the face value. If you pick up any magazine, whether it's Lynn's or other stamp publication, you can see modern US issues advertised at significantly below face value. That's pretty discouraging for people looking to collect. Now, a more basic question would be to say, have we actually lost the urge to collect? Well, the short answer is no. There are still collectors. If you look, there are many collectors in other fields. Other fields are growing. There's continued interest. In an article several years ago, the Wall Street Journal talked about the car market. And their argument for the car market, this is the collectible antique cars, was that whilst there are fewer collectors, those collectors that there are more passionate about their interest, and they're also significantly wealthier than the collectors were in the past. Another question that comes into this, have we lost the urge to collect, is has the aspect of investment actually replaced the concept of collecting? Well, the idea of stamps and investment is certainly not a new thing. If you take the example of Stanley Gibbons, which recently put its investment division in Guernsey into liquidation, this is not the first time that Stanley Gibbons had tried to promote the idea of stamps as an investment. They did it significantly back in the late 1970s. The end result was much the same as it was recently. The individual investors ended up losing money, and it was certainly detrimental to the hobby. Again, is that the sole factor? Probably not. We have this whole confluence of different factors. Another aspect is the question of mentors. If you look at philately maybe 40, 50 years ago, many people started to collect under the mentorship of a street level stamp dealer. They would go to the stamp store, they would get guidance, they would get mentorship from those dealers. Obviously, as the street level stamp stores have disappeared and things have either switched to shows, exhibitions, or to the internet, you have lost some of that mentorship aspect. Now, again, is that the sole explanation? No, it's really a multi-causal problem. Now, in recent years, people have argued that the internet has killed the hobby or has diminished the hobby. The argument is not very convincing because, in fact, the internet has brought many, many benefits to the hobby. For most collectors, they have now far greater access to material for purchase, all these online stores that are available to them. In the old days, auction catalogs came through the mail. The auction houses had really very limited distribution of their catalogs. Today, most catalogs are available online. They're available to download. You can actually do online bidding and so on. Now, societies have their websites, their online journals, there are online forums to ask questions, and there are other groups such as the Global Philatelic Library, which consolidates the listings of 27 libraries around the world. The internet has brought benefits to the hobby. So again, to say that the idea that the internet has been detrimental, I don't think is very convincing. Now, one of the big failures of the hobby, certainly going back, say, from the late 1970s onwards, has really been the failure to effectively promote the hobby, to encourage people to come into the hobby, to participate in philately. For example, one of the organizations that was set up in the 70s in the UK was the Stamp Collecting Promotion Council. What did it actually achieve? Well, very little. Does anybody remember it today? Well, no. 1976, they had another attempt to promote the idea of philately in the UK, the Festival of Stamps, held in Westminster. Who remembers it? Again, really nobody. Perhaps a controversial opinion, the APS Youth Fellowship Program. A lot of money has been poured into this with really not a great return. How many has it enlarged the hobby? Well, one or two individuals have benefited from it, but the return on the investment, probably not that great. The emphasis on youth and children. Well, that children are a very, very difficult group to handle. The other argument is, what does the average young person bring to the hobby within a short period of time? Well, they're often reliant on parents. They're often reliant on grandparents. They also don't, they have a limited budget. Now, if you look at the American Philatelic Society publication, the American Philatelist, one of the most interesting parts of the magazine is the list of new members. The list of new members published every month at the back of the magazine. Surprisingly, one of the things that they publish for most people is their age. And those ages are really very interesting. Most of them are older and most of them are retired. In fact, many of them, when they list their profession or their occupation, they actually specifically say that they are retired. Can we solve all the problems of philately by focusing on the youth today? Well, that's not necessarily going to bring a significant change in the short term. Perhaps the dividend would come 20, 30 years down the road. The question is, how can we approach the hobby today and try and solve some of the issues in the more short term? Now, let's take a specific example of looking at stamp shows. In Milwaukee, you have the annual Milwaukee exhibition. I've come to a number of those. The one most memorable one I remember was held at the, I don't know if it was the fairgrounds, where it was in the cattle auction area or display area. That's many, many years ago. But what do most shows have in common? Well, they have the dealer area and they have the exhibits. And this is just a picture of the exhibits at the New York 2016 International Show. And we see lots of frames, we see lots of stamps, but we don't see many viewers. Now, if you look even at national shows here and overseas, it's a very similar issue. There's huge amounts of space devoted to the exhibits, but a very, very limited, small audience actually taking the time to look at those exhibits. Coincidentally, we also have this declining attendance at shows and exhibitions. If you look at the US international shows, going back, I mean, probably the high watermark was Ameripex in '86. The shows at the international shows in London, the high watermark was 1980, the London 1980 show. Since then, every 10 years, or approximately 10 years, when you've had the international shows, the attendance has declined significantly every decade. The last CAPEX show, or the last CAPEX show in '96, the attendance was terrible. I forget the actual published number, but it was tiny for an international exhibition. So there's a disconnect. We have these shows which are still presented in the way that they were many decades ago, but clearly they're not offering what the audience wants. So the hobby has been very slow to adopt new ideas and innovations. The core of the hobby has been largely unchanged. Now, is that a problem? Well, yes. The world has changed significantly in the last few decades. One of the problems, perhaps, is that our hobby is far too formalized and governed by rules, especially in the exhibiting forum. if we want to encourage people to exhibit, we shouldn't necessarily be emphasizing the rules. We should be trying to give them some sort of freedom to present their material in the way they want to. Now, for those of you who've been waiting for the COVID pandemic, well, we've finally got around to it. What's basically been the impact of the pandemic? Well, we've had a tremendous cancellation and postponement of events nationally and internationally. Here's just a series of exhibitions that have been either postponed or canceled. No in-person society meetings, public auctions that used to be public auctions are now behind closed doors without any public present. Well, what has happened? How has the hobby responded to this? Well, organizations trying to justify their existence have presented us with a whole abundance of online talks and presentations. There's a huge abundance of Zoom meetings. Quite frankly, I don't know how anybody has the time to even attend a fraction of the meetings that are available. We also now have the virtual exhibitions and competitions. More and more, there's more and more social media influencers trying to dominate the hobby and tell us all about everything. The mainstream media, of course, is also trying to convince us that there's been a resurgence in the hobby. Back in April of 2020, the UK-based Observer magazine ran an article. In June, the Wall Street Journal also ran an article talking about stamp collecting suddenly back in vogue. The irony is that both articles keep talking about an escape from screen-based lives and that stamp collecting is more than a hobby, it is a lifestyle and a community. Well, thinking back to that original definition, is that really philately? A lifestyle and a community? Are all these Zoom meetings and all this online activity, is that really an escape from screen-based lives? There seems to be a disconnect between the core theme of those articles and some of those points. The new buzzwords in philately seem to have gone from what do you collect, what are the areas of interest, what are the best stamp albums to use, to virtual, digital, online, and so on and so on. We also have all these social media influencers who are not necessarily philatelists. Many of them, do they really collect? Thinking back to that definition of philately. Not everybody would agree with that point of view, but really, philately used to be about collecting stamps. And is that much of what is happening really strictly philatelic? Now, social media, especially in the last few weeks and certainly in the run-up to the election, was certainly controversial. Controversial in the real world and arguably controversial in the philatelic world too. Influencers, well, what are the interests of the influencers? Well, they're trying to elevate their status, but really do they contribute very much to the state of the hobby? Do we really need all their opinions and influences? Many of the messages, the highly repetitive messages that are sent out, everybody tweets and sends out the same messages. It's reminiscent of junk mail. And what did we do with junk mail? Well, we threw it in the garbage. And so there's a very good argument that much of this is really not, it's not perhaps the best direction for the hobby. Again, not everybody might agree with that opinion, but it's certainly worth considering. Now, let's think about some of these more basic questions. As I've alluded to already, are Zoom meetings, YouTube videos, and online presentations really an escape from the millennial screen-based life? Or in fact, is it just the environment that they're comfortable in? Another question is, will this newfound millennial appeal fade when the lifestyle that the Wall Street Journal talked about returns to normal and we start going back to in-person events, in-person shows, in-person auctions, and so on? Again, another question, is there a connection between posting images on Instagram or wherever of mostly modern material of colorful pictures and actually forming a collection? Is the instant gratification and becoming an influencer really compatible or concordant with being a philatelist? Well, digital philately is not just social media. The social media might be loud and constant, but it really, the digital world is far, far more than just that social media. Here's just a series of areas in which digital philately is very, very important. Ironically, the last one, the websites, I actually managed to forget from the list, and kindly Marianne pointed out to me that it probably should be on the list. And I give her credit and thanks for reminding me that websites are a very, very important part of digital philately. But think about how all of these areas, all of these sections actually have helped the hobby. Now, virtual shows and exhibitions. Everybody likes to take credit for having introduced the idea of digital exhibitions or virtual exhibitions this year. Well, in fact, if you go back, the ASDA back in the early 2000s, 2005, actually introduced digital exhibits. They had a competition, Digital Philatelic Studies. And at the time, maybe it was a little ahead of its time, the conservative group at the hobby said, well, you know, this is really not what we should be doing. You actually need to be able to see the real stamps. We have to be able to verify that the exhibitor actually owns the stamps that they show, and so on. So anyway, that's really where the virtual shows and exhibitions began. This year, however, there's been an abundance, and here's just a few of the events that have been taking place. One of the most interesting ones was Philex 2020 in Bangladesh. That exhibition in Bangladesh attracted 756,000 visits from people in 76 different countries. That's a remarkable number. The Philavirtue exhibition in India had, I think it's about 300 frames of exhibits. Virtual Autumn Stampex. They claim to have had 4,324 unique visitors in the initial 3 days. I don't know what the figures are for Philavirtue or the Iranian Society. And also, I don't know what the summer show event, the APS one is, but I'm sure it would be very interesting to look at those numbers of unique visitors and compare it with, say, the APS summer event a year ago. Now, what are the advantages of us shifting shows and exhibitions to a virtual arena? Well, it's an awful lot cheaper. You also get a far wider geographical participation. Potentially, assuming the willingness of the organizing group, there's a lot more opportunities for flexibility and diversity in exhibiting. Perhaps one could have more educative exhibits. One could find ways to, again, highlight more the issues of philatelic knowledge and research. One could also include different multimedia presentations into the exhibits. Again, taking full advantage of the virtual world, there is really an ability to innovate and to become far more creative rather than just to have your hands tied by a very rule-bound, traditional, conservative idea of what a show or an exhibition, or an exhibit rather, should be. There are pros and cons to virtual shows and exhibitions, as I mentioned. With the ASDA back in 2005, the traditionalists, especially the judges, were very much, we must see the real stamps. We want to know that the exhibitor actually has what he's showing. At that time, one of the ideas which was considered and experimented with was that people could include illustrations of items that they did not necessarily own. But the requirement was that, as you would have with a book or a publication, you actually had to cite the source of the illustration and give credit for use of the illustration in your exhibit. Now, if the emphasis is on research and knowledge, do you necessarily have to own the item? Or could you actually make use of an illustration from a library or an institutional collection? Probably also for the judges, there is, let's be blunt, a little more resistance because, especially with the international exhibitions, they get paid trips to foreign parts. Now, if they're sitting at home in their stamp office or their stamp room, judging exhibits over the internet, all of a sudden the expense for the shows and the benefits to the judges of those trips disappear. There are other issues. I mean, for many people, the in-person socialization that they do at shows is very important. That doesn't happen necessarily with the virtual shows. There's also, let's be frank, for some people, there's a barrier to entry, that of computer skills. Some people do still handwrite their exhibits, few and far between, but some people still do because they feel they don't have the computer skills. If everything shifts to a virtual show, is the playing field level, or do you have that barrier to entry of people's computer skills? Well, let's make some assumptions. We have an effective, or hopefully effective, vaccine, affordable. Hopefully in 2021, there will be the ability to travel nationally and internationally again. The question becomes, what type of events and activities do philatelists actually want to come out of the other side? Do they want a return to in-person events with the presence of large numbers of people? Or are they actually quite happy to see a lot of those in-person events permanently replaced by online activities, Zoom meetings, or stay-at-home activities? The question is, what do people actually want? What do they feel would be important and beneficial to them moving forward? Perhaps, again, this may be controversial, but I think that one of the best answers would be, moving forward, a combination between the virtual events and the in-person events. The in-person social side to the hobby was and still is very, very important. But we need to find a model that balances the virtual and the in-person, which actually meets all of the needs and benefits all of the constituents in the hobbies, the dealers, the auctioneers, the collectors, the exhibitors, the curious, the millennials. We need to find a balance that works for everybody. Now, one of the difficulties, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, everybody is rushing in. Every organization is having Zoom meetings. We have this abundance of online exhibitions. For example, the Iranian group having its own exhibition. A lot of this is duplicative. There are lots of interested parties all essentially trying to move forward. One of the things which does seem to be lacking is a real coordination between the groups. Many entities, many organizations are throwing their meetings open freely to people. Now, long term, is that a good thing? Well, if somebody has got used to in 2020 and early 2021 to attending meetings free because the public has been invited, are they necessarily then going to be willing to contribute a subscription? Are they going to be willing to join the organization that they've been benefiting from for a year or more? That's a question. I mean, one of the issues, and again, this may be controversial, but philately, participation in philately has really been too cheap for too long. Many local societies have tiny, tiny subscriptions. It doesn't even cover the costs of running the organization. You think about many specialist society groups where the annual membership subscription might be $25 or $30 a year. 2 movie tickets. I mean, it's crazy how inexpensive participation in the hobby has been for a very, very long time. Now, one of the criticisms that could be made of the FIP, and I'm always happy to criticize where necessary, the FIP has not, unfortunately, been a great leader in bringing us out of the COVID situation. It's certainly not been in the forefront of implementing new ideas. And perhaps there is a role for it in trying to coordinate things, trying to bring in the technology experts, trying to find a way to focus funding where it would actually bring a benefit to the hobby. Has the digital internet frenetic carry on actually changed the hobby? Well, not necessarily. It's really up to us, the collectors, to take advantage of the opportunities of what the internet frenzy has offered us in the last almost 12 months. Some of the things are beneficial, some I think are detrimental, but we as collectors, we as participants in the hobby need to say what is important to us, what have we felt has been beneficial, and what do we feel we want to take back from the pre-COVID days. It's really up to us. I mean, we have to be willing to say what we want. Now, one of the things which is often said is that it's far easier to generate questions, but it's much, much harder to formulate the answers. And as I say, we should all be asking ourselves, how do we want our hobby to be coming out of this changed environment of the COVID crisis? What do we want of our national organizations? What do we want of our libraries? What do we want of our societies? What sort of shows do we want? Do we still want the traditional exhibiting with those rows and rows of empty frames? How do we want to be judged? Do we still want to be judged, or do we want to be able to present our material, to share it, but not necessarily with the same emphasis on judging? At the end of the day, we want our hobby to be fun. We also want it to be profitable. And we also want it to survive for the future. So there are many, many questions which start to come to mind. And Marianne suggested that, you know, it might be a good point to stop with a whole series of questions. And then she suggested that we might perhaps have a kind of open discussion amongst people, saying what they think, what they feel, how have they experienced Philately in the last 12 months? What do they want moving forward? What would be important to them to retain from this online digital world of the last 12 months in a new, hopefully a new, potentially in-person world moving forward? And I put together a few questions. Some of them are deliberately provocative.